All right, welcome back, forensic students. Today we're talking about investigative processes. So this is just a fancy way of saying the different steps that investigators go through to process a crime scene. So this is a lengthier lesson. If you are following along with me, needing to take notes, I'm going to try to move through quickly, so just pause the video as needed. Right, so just as a car needs fuel to run, criminal laboratories have to have evidence to run. So evidence can make or break a criminal case. We've talked about that before. Evidence can be used to convict or exonerate, like in the case of the Innocence Project, or prove a defendant to be not guilty of an accused crime. But before evidence can be used, its presence has to be recognized, which is easier said than done. So forensic science begins at the crime scene. We oftentimes will say from the crime scene to the courtroom. So investigative processes sort of trace evidence from the crime scene where it's collected, processed, analyzed, and then taken all the way to the very end where it is hopefully produced as evidence in the court of law. So if a forensic investigator cannot recognize evidence or can't properly preserve it for lab examination, then it's of no use, and that can be detrimental to a case. So with proper training, police agencies and investigators can ensure competent performance at crime scenes. And so that's sort of what we're looking at today. How can investigators ensure that they are doing the best job that they can to maintain the integrity of the evidence from the crime scene to the courtroom? All right, so first, let's talk about the crime scene. Who could possibly be at the crime scene? Now, this just depends on the jurisdiction. So oftentimes in larger cities, you'll see all of these people show up at a crime scene. I live in a small town, so we don't see many of these people, and in some cases, these different roles happen to be the same person. So at a crime scene, usually you'll have first responders, oftentimes a local police department, possibly a district attorney. That just depends. Typically, district attorneys aren't on call to just show up at crime scenes. With new advancements in technology, there are ways that district attorneys can be contacted in the event that a warrant needs to be issued. Crime scene investigators, this again depends on the jurisdiction, but their job is to just document the scene in detail and collect evidence. I know in a small town like where I live, the crime scene investigators are also the detectives, which happen to also be our local police. So, I'm sure in big cities like Chicago or Atlanta, you're going to have multiple people who do these jobs. Medical examiner, so if you have a death investigation, you might have somebody that has to work with the coroner to determine time of death, cause of death, and all those good things. So a medical examiner would be a person who we would rely on there. Detectives, so sometimes the detectives are the crime scene investigators, but sometimes there are special divisions or separate agencies that are called in to just focus on detective work. And then you can have different specialists. So sometimes specialists are called in for different reasons. Anthropologists might be called in if human remains are found. Psychologists can be called in, like in the case of a serial killer. You can have entomologists that are called in if you have a body that's found and there's maggot activity. So all of these different people have some place in crime scene investigation. So investigators are trained. They are highly trained to follow certain steps that ensure that when evidence is found, that it's secured and collected properly, because it has to maintain its integrity as it travels from the crime scene to the courtroom. So the chronological documentation, we call this a paper trail, that records all the people, all the places that the evidence has traveled or who has touched the evidence or come in contact with it, is documented. We call this the chain of custody. So what are the steps of crime scene investigation? I'm going to point this out just briefly. If you are familiar with the JonBenet Ramsey case, if you're not, you might want to do some research before you watch the rest of the video. But the JonBenet Ramsey case is a great example of why it's so important for investigators to follow these steps that we are about to go over. Because this case, it's basically a murder. The murder of a 6-year-old girl was never solved because investigators failed to maintain the integrity of any evidence that was found, and they did not properly go through the correct procedures in securing the scene. And so it was a hot mess. It really was. And so this little girl's murder was never solved as a result. All right, so we're going to go through and talk about each step of crime scene investigation, starting with the first step, securing the scene. So when you think about securing the scene, I want you to think about like the police tape that you're familiar with, the crime scene do not cross tape. So that's part of what goes on in securing a crime scene. Now, over the years, I live in Georgia, so I have talked to many members of the GBI, which is the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. I've also talked to members of my local police and sheriff's department. And depending on who you talk to, some of these steps are a little, there's different protocol within each of these steps. I know the GBI, this is much more extensive, and they will tell you there are many more than 7 steps. But for a middle or high school forensics class, this is just an overview, the basics. So securing the crime scene, you're going to have a first responder or first officer that's going to arrive at the scene, and they're going to try to preserve and protect the area as much as humanly possible. The problem is that first priority is given to medical assistance for anybody that needs it. So if you have a crime scene and you have people who are in need of medical assistance, you're going to try to maintain the integrity of the evidence best you can, but sometimes that's not possible. But the safety of all individuals is number one priority. So once everybody is safe, extensive efforts are going to be made to exclude unauthorized persons. So this would be family members or that may live in the house that serves as a crime scene. This could be bystanders. It could also be like news reporters. So a first responder or arriving officer is going to just make sure that the scene is secured. They're going to do this by putting up ropes or barricades or that police tape that we're familiar with. They're going to strategically position guards at entry points and exit points to prevent people that are not authorized to access the scene. And sometimes they have to spend the night at a crime scene to make sure that nobody comes in and tampers with any evidence. So, the life of a crime scene investigator is not always as glamorous as it is portrayed to be on some of the shows like CSI and Criminal Minds. All right, so securing the crime scene, every individual who enters the scene must be documented. So we have these things called crime scene logs where an officer is responsible for just writing down and documenting anybody who comes in and out of the crime scene, what agency they're with, what time they came in, what time they left, the date, and sometimes that information is needed during a criminal proceeding. All right, the next step after the scene is secured is the witnesses are separated. Now, a forensic investigator will tell you that sometimes this has to be done simultaneously. So you might have a couple guys working on securing and recording who comes in and out of the scene while you have other guys who are separating witnesses and questioning witnesses. So this is not a step-by-step process where you have to finish one before you start another. All right, so separating the witnesses is the next priority. Witnesses shouldn't be allowed to talk to one another. We don't want them to corroborate their stories or change anything. Investigators will compare their accounts, and witnesses are separated to avoid working together or to avoid being influenced by one another. So there are some questions that trained investigators usually ask of eyewitnesses, and those are like, what did you see? Where were you when you made this observation? Did you happen to see anyone else or anything else? Do you have any other information that might be helpful? Notice these are not specific questions. Again, investigators are trained in the way the brain works, and after a traumatic event, the brain is very susceptible to being manipulated. And so the questioning has to be worded very carefully. All right, step 3 is scanning the crime scene. This is where investigators just kind of do a walkthrough and they do a quick scan. They can, at this point, start to mark evidence with evidence markers or start to talk and document anything that they see. Evidence markers or evidence placards are what you see in the picture here. Sometimes they are numbers, sometimes they are letters. A more thorough search is going to be done at a later step, but this is just where they do sort of a scan and a brief walkthrough. The purpose of this step is just to allow records of the scene to be made quickly and efficiently. So once they walk the scene and start to mark evidence with evidence placards, then somebody's going to come behind them to photograph. And so we call this seeing the scene, photographing the crime scene. So during this step, a trained photographer is just going to take all kinds of pictures of the evidence that has been marked. Lots and lots and lots of pictures. So I had a GBI agent come and talk to my class last year, and one of the students asked the question about how many pictures do you take at a crime scene? And of course it depends, but the investigator said that on average they take 3,000 pictures at a crime scene, which is crazy. 3,000 pictures. So anytime new evidence is marked, photographs are going to be made. So the photographer is pretty much full-time at the crime scene. And we're going to talk about actual procedures for crime scene photography at a later date. All right, so this is one of those steps that's not necessarily done after the scene is photographed. This can be simultaneously. So as this scene is being scanned and photographed, somebody could be sketching the scene. So once photographs have been taken, the crime scene investigator is going to sketch the scene. It's just a rough sketch that depicts dimensions of the scene, shows location. Has been a lot of technology advances that help aid in this. So there's CAD programs that investigators use. They can actually set up tripods and get distances and measurements and obstacles and objects scanned, and then it can generate like a 3-dimensional view of the room or the crime scene. So traditionally, sketching the scene was a physical hand sketch, like you see in the picture, documentation of the crime scene. And for the most part, that is still a practice that most agencies use, but there have been a lot of advancements in technology. Again, when the GBI came to visit my classroom last year, they brought one of their tripods and showed us how it scans the room. It measured distances to fix points in the classroom, and then it generated an image on their computer of my classroom, where the windows were, where the walls were, the distance from the point of the tripod to the wall, to the windows, the doors, desk, and it was amazing. So definitely technological advances are changing this process up. So the sketch should be very intentional to match the photographs, because when this stuff, and if this stuff does go to court, photographs of evidence, so like you see in this picture, they have the victim marked as placard 1. In the crime scene sketch, the victim should also be marked as number 1. So all of this has to line up. So sometimes the photographer and the sketcher will work together. Searching the scene is the more detailed, intentional use of trying to use a certain search search pattern to find evidence. So during this step, investigators are really going to focus on finding all the evidence in using a search pattern. So search pattern's declared, and the investigators work to try to find any evidence that they may have missed during step 3, which was scanning the scene. If they happen to find new evidence, it's marked with the placards or evidence markers. A photographer comes back and makes sure they get photographs, and then it's added to the sketch. Now, the next step is securing and collecting evidence. This is the very end. So the scene has been searched. Now they're ready to secure that evidence, collect it, and then take it wherever it needs to go. So physical evidence can be anything from massive objects that are very difficult to package, sometimes impossible, to very microscopic trace pieces of evidence that require being packaged with something like a bundle. And we'll talk about that in a minute. So each piece of evidence, no matter how big or how small, has to be preserved in its original state, best way possible. Sometimes that is not always possible, but the intention is to try to preserve the evidence in its original state. Each item that is part of the evidence in the crime scene should be handled very carefully. You'll notice investigators wear gloves so that they prevent cross-contamination. A lot of times, I know with arson investigation, the investigators, if they touch a piece of evidence with one pair of gloves, they will actually take them off and bag their gloves with the evidence or attach it to the evidence and put on a new pair of gloves so that they don't cross-contaminate. So a lot of times jurisdictions will practice that method as well. So the search for evidence is not limited to the crime scene. Evidence can be found on the body during an autopsy. There can be primary crime scenes and secondary crime scenes, even tertiary crime scenes. There, of course, when you start to question witnesses, there may be leads that take you away from the original crime scene. So investigators have to keep all that in mind. Investigators handle and process evidence in a way that prevents any change from taking place to the evidence until it can be analyzed by a trained forensic lab expert. The use of disposable gloves is vital when handling evidence, and evidence should remain unmoved until investigators have documented in the form of notes, pictures, sketches, and such. Crime scene investigators have a large assortment of packaging materials and tools that are at their disposal. And there's all kinds of different things. We're going to begin to talk about how to package specific pieces of evidence, but investigators are prepared for really, really big items, really, really small items, and so they have quite a kit put together. All right, so the chain of custody we mentioned before is the process of protecting evidence from the crime scene to the courtroom. And part of that path is also through the lab. So according to the chain of custody, evidence should be packaged in the following way. So appropriate packaging should be used. For example, if it is a weapon, there is special packaging for weapons. If it is evidence used in arson investigation and there could be accelerant on the evidence, it's going to have to be packaged a specific way. If it is really tiny evidence, like a hair sample that could easily be lost if you put it in a plastic bag, there is a special way to package this evidence. So investigators are trained, and then they have the tools to package that evidence, the materials. Packaging should be sealed with evidence tape when possible. And that evidence tape should showcase the signature of the collecting officer. So I don't know if you can see in the pictures, but you can see like some in the bottom picture, the red evidence tape. It is actually sealing up the entry point for this sexual assault evidence kit. And then you can see where the investigator has signed saying, hey, this is me. I put this evidence in here. I secured it, and now I'm going to send it to the next person. that seal can never be broken. So you might ask, how in the world is the lab analyst going to get to the evidence if they can't break the seal? And the answer is they've got to figure out some other way. So some other entry point into the box. Sometimes with these boxes, there will be like a little part where you can like push through and open, sort of like when you buy a 12-pack of soda. But they have to be very careful not to break the evidence tape or cut the evidence seal. A chain of custody log also has to be filled out. So everybody that touches the evidence, processes the evidence, or anywhere that the evidence goes throughout the whole process of crime scene to courtroom, they have to be represented on what we call the chain of custody. So you can see in the top picture, the chain of custody is being filled out by whoever is dealing with this evidence. So those are sort of two different parts to evidence collection. Again, you can see in this picture, evidence tape has sealed and secured the evidence inside the bag. There is a chain of custody sticker on the outside of the bag, and so that will be completed by the agent that collected this evidence. So they will sign the evidence packaging seal. They will also update the chain of custody log with dates and times and names. And the chain of custody log must travel with the evidence. And it must include everybody that had any contact with the evidence. A lot of times this goes to court. And of course, if you're a defense attorney, you're going to be checking to make sure there are no loopholes. So I want to talk just a second, because earlier we mentioned, like, if you have something really tiny, like a hair sample, there's a specific way to package that. We call it a bindle. So a bindle is used to package really, really tiny pieces of evidence. Sometimes it's called a druggist fold. Basically what they do is they take a piece of paper, they place the evidence right smack dab in the center, and they fold it strategically so that that evidence cannot fall out. So they'll fold it inward 2 times, and then up and down, and then secure it with evidence tape. And this just ensures that that piece of evidence is in the center, it's not lost, and then it's packaged according to other types of evidence. Once evidence is collected, it can be transferred to a lab for further analysis. Oftentimes, the evidence is not processed by the same people who investigate and collect the evidence. Sometimes it has to be shipped off and sent off. And of course, the integrity has to still be maintained. So anybody that handles the evidence has to update themselves on the chain of custody log. Also, in addition, once a lab analyst looks at or processes a piece of evidence, they have to place it in new packaging. Now, they have to keep the old packaging, but the old packaging and the evidence goes into a new packaging with the chain of custody log updated and new evidence tape and a signature. So failure to do so will result or could result in the inadmissibility of this evidence in court. That just means a judge, if they find out that somebody didn't update the chain of custody log, or they skipped somebody intentionally or unintentionally, a judge might say, sorry, we're not going to allow this evidence to be entered into the courtroom because the integrity of the evidence was not maintained. All right, so if you're my student, you're going to complete this securing and packaging evidence close reading passage, and I will see you in the next lesson.